Lecture number 9. In this lecture, we will look at the last 3 oracles of Zechariah, at least the dated oracles of Zechariah, before we move into the second half of the book. And we'll be looking at slides 76 through 84. So if you could locate yourself on slide 76, we will begin. Here in the middle of chapter 6, verse 9, the word of Yahweh came to Zechariah. Now the expression, the word of Yahweh came to me, indicates a transition. Prior to that, we have gone through the 8 night visions, each of which were introduced by some kind of device like, "What do you see?" or the angel speaking to me said, "Look, see, what is this that is appearing?" Those kinds of language, those kinds of words. But when the language appears now, the word of Yahweh came to me in chapter 6 and verse 9, this means that we are moving from a visionary literary circumstance to a non-visionary setting. And so the word of the Lord comes to Zechariah, and there are going to be 3 oracles that will follow. One will be an oracle about Joshua's crown. One will be an oracle about fasting and the nature of true fasting. And one will be basically a summary oracle about some of the major themes that have appeared so far in Haggai and Zechariah, as these 2 prophets have worked very hard to inspire the people to continue rebuilding the temple. This summary oracle is about the city of truth and the holy mountain, but it does resonate with themes that have already been raised. So with that in mind, go, if you will, to slide 77. This is the oracle about Joshua's crown. The word of Yahweh came to me, he says, "Take silver and gold from the exiles Heldai, Jabijah, and Jediah, who have earlier arrived in Babylon, and go the same day to the house of Josiah ben Zephaniah, and take the silver and gold, and make a crown, and set it on the head of the high priest Joshua ben Jehozadak. Tell him this is what Yahweh Sabaoth says. Here is the man whose name is the branch, and he will branch out from his place and build the temple of Yahweh. It is he who will build the temple of Yahweh, and he will be clothed with majesty, and will sit and rule on his throne, and he will be a priest on his throne, and there will be harmony between the 2. Now, in this vision, the crown was to be set on the head of Joshua the high priest. Apparently, there were Jews who traveled back and forth between Jerusalem and Babylon. And on this particular occasion, there is a group of exiles who have come from Babylon recently to Judah and to the city of Jerusalem. We don't know much about them other than the names that are mentioned here. But they apparently have brought offerings to assist in the rebuilding of the temple. And so from these offerings, Zechariah is to take silver and gold, and he is to have a crown made to be set on the head of Joshua. Then there is to be an announcement. Here is the man whose name is Branch. Now, presumably, the announcement, even though the crown is set on the head of Joshua, the announcement is to be made with respect to Zerubbabel. And we know that really going back to chapter 3 and verse 8, in which the branch is described, and in this case it seems to be referring to Zerubbabel. Joshua the high priest figures in the announcement because he's the priestly leader, and he is the spiritual representative of the community. He is crowned, and yet Zerubbabel is announced. And this anticipates what is described in verse 13, that he, that is Zerubbabel, will be clothed with majesty and will sit and rule on his throne, and he will be a priest on his throne. Now, it's this idea that he is both to rule as a royal figure, but he is also to serve as a priest at the same time that is significant, because there is in this passage then the idea of a future union between both the priesthood and the kingship. Now, that will not be immediately apparent in the history of the Post-Exilic period. First of all, Zerubbabel never actually became a king, and by pedigree, he certainly couldn't have been a priest. Joshua is a priest, But on the other hand, he doesn't come from the line of David, so he could not be a king. And yet somehow in Zerubbabel, this figure who is typological of the future, there is this idea that at some point the priesthood and the kingship is going to be united. And Zerubbabel and Joshua stand as signs toward that future. We need to talk a little bit about the symbolism of the branch. So go to slide 78. We mentioned this earlier when we were talking about the word branch in chapter 3 and verse 8 of Zechariah. But now we want to look at this a little more closely. First of all, if you go back to the beginning of this metaphor, the metaphor begins quite a long time earlier in the 8th century in the prophecies of Isaiah. In Isaiah, there is the prediction that the people of Judah are going to be decimated in the future. And in fact, right shortly after his call in chapter 6, there is a passage that describes this. In chapter 6 and verse 11, Isaiah has asked concerning his call, how long will the people be ever hearing but never understanding, seeing but never perceiving? And the answer was, until the cities are ruined, and the cities are without inhabitants, and the houses are deserted, and the fields ruined and ravaged. And the Lord has sent everyone far away. Now, obviously, this passage in Isaiah anticipates the exile, even though it's a couple of hundred years before the exile. It anticipates the exile, but notice the imagery that is used in verse 13. But as the terebinth oak leaves stumps when they are cut down, so the holy seed will be the stump in the land. In other words, the families of Judah will be like a huge deforestation. The trees will be cut down. The trees of Judah, the families of Judah, in other words. And the metaphor of the forest and the metaphor of the stumps is the metaphor of the cutting off of the families of Judah and the leaving of stumps in the land because of the exile. However, Isaiah has not exhausted that metaphor because in two other passages he talks about a branch that will come out of these stumps. One is the very familiar passage that we often read at Christmas season in Isaiah 11, in which a shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse, and from his roots a branch will bear fruit, and the Spirit of the Lord will rest upon him. Now, in this particular passage about the coming of the branch, there is described in Isaiah chapter 11 all of the wonderful effects of the coming of the branch. It will result in righteousness in the earth. It will result in total peace. The wolf will lie down with the lamb. The leopard will lie down with the goat. Cow will feed with the bear. Even children, infants, will play with cobras. And the young child will put his hand into the viper's nest, and there will be no harm or destruction. In fact, nothing will harm or destroy in my holy mountain, because the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord. This coming of the Messianic branch is also mentioned by Isaiah in chapter 4. Verse 2, in which he says, in that day the branch of the Lord will be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the land will be the pride and the glory of the survivors of Israel. Those who are left in Zion, that in Isaiah's language would mean the remnant. Those who are left in Zion, who remain in Jerusalem, will be called holy. And then there is the cleansing of the people in Zion. So this imagery of the branch in Isaiah begins with the idea that Isaiah will in fact, not Isaiah, but that Judah in fact will suffer exile. They will be taken from the land. And the families of Judah will be cut down like stumps in the land. But out of one of those family stumps, the family stump of Jesse, there will come a little root. Now a century later, Jeremiah picks up this same imagery. If you go to Jeremiah 23, verses 5 and 6, the oracle says, the days are coming, declares Yahweh, when I will raise up to David a righteous branch, a king who will reign wisely and do what is just and right in the land. And in his days Judah will be saved, and Israel will live in safety. And this is the name by which it will be called, Yahweh Sidkenu, or the Lord our righteousness. So Jeremiah uses the same metaphor, the branch metaphor, and he looks to the future for someone from David's line. Then in chapter 33 of Jeremiah, Jeremiah once again picks up this same idea. And so he says in verses 15 and 16, "In those days and at that time I will make a righteous branch sprout from David's line." So the little shoot that comes up from the stump of Jesse goes through the family of David. And from the family of David comes a righteous branch of the future who will do what is right, and Jerusalem will be saved, and Judah will be saved, and it will be a time in which the Lord is called the Lord Tsidkenu, the Lord our righteousness. Now it's on the basis of these earlier metaphors of the branch that Zechariah draws upon this same metaphor in describing Zerubbabel. And so in the proclamation that is given by Joshua, or at the crowning of Joshua, there is the statement, "Here is the man whose name is Branch." Zerubbabel, who is the grandson of Jehoiakim, who is the rightful last king of Judah in the line of David, carries in himself the basic family pedigree, the family seed of the family of David. And as I mentioned in the previous lecture, when we talked about Zechariah 3 and 8, this is picked up in the New Testament in the genealogy of Matthew, in which Jeconiah, as he's called in Matthew, or it was the same as Jehoiakim, and then through Zerubbabel become the family tree of Jesus Christ. Slide 79. Now, the idea of the union of rulership and priesthood is very apparent in this passage. There will be a priest, but the priest will be on a throne. There will be one clothed in majesty to rule, and yet at the same time he is a priest. And the two will be harmonized, or the two will become one. This is an idea that actually has roots in Psalm 110, in which there is the description of David both as the ruler of Israel, but also as a priest after the order of Melchizedek. So back in Psalm 110, there is the same basic idea that the royal line and the priestly line will come together somehow in God's future. Zerubbabel and Joshua serve then as typological links to this messianic future, because as was said back in chapter 3 and verse 8 of Zechariah, they are symbols of things to come. And the reference to building the temple using those who are far away, chapter 6 and verse 15, those who are far away will come to help build the temple of Yahweh, and you will know that Yahweh Sabaoth has sent me to you. This will happen if you diligently obey Yahweh your God. This statement indicates that the building of the second temple has links to God's future, and in particular to his messianic future. Not only will the temple be built, but somehow this temple will become a symbol of the gathering of the nations to worship the Lord. So if this is true, then the people who are rebuilding this second temple must be enthusiastic about it. They must put their whole hearts into it, because they are part of God's future. Their work is linked to God's eternal plan that stretches far ahead into the future. The fact that Joshua's crown is kept as a memorial in the temple points to that future, and points to a future beyond simply the building of the second temple. And so they're going to save this crown as a memorial in the temple of Yahweh. And this looks ahead to something that God is going to do, just as Haggai said he would shake the nations, and in the end, the glory of the second temple would be greater than the glory of the first temple. Slide 80. Chapter 7 in Zechariah is an oracle about fasting, and it comes a couple of years later, and it addresses a question about ritual fasting. Now, the new temple, of course, is being built. In fact, by this time, it's probably well along the way toward completion. That being so, the question then rises among some of the exiles, is it appropriate to continue to mourn for the exile of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple? We've been doing this all these years since the temple has fallen. Now that the temple is being rebuilt, should we continue to do this? If you look at the right side of slide 80 in the block, you will see the 4 ritual feasts that are mentioned in Zechariah, and then they are cross-referenced with passages in 2 Kings and the book of Jeremiah. And these would be the 4 fasts that the people were observing. In the 10th month, they observed a fast that remembered the beginning of the siege against Jerusalem. This is when the armies of Nebuchadnezzar II surrounded Jerusalem, cut off all of its communication and its supplies, and began the siege that would end in the destruction of the city. Then, sometime later, in the siege, in the 4th month, they remembered the day that the wall was breached. This is when the Babylonian armies actually broke through the wall and began pouring into the city of Jerusalem. Within another month, they mourned the destruction of the temple. This happened in the 5th month, when the soldiers of Nebuchadnezzar burned the temple and looted all of the precious objects. And then finally, there is the fast of the 7th month, which remembers the terror at the time of the assassination of Gedaliah, which is mentioned in the book of Jeremiah. Gedaliah was the Babylonian appointed governor over Jerusalem after Nebuchadnezzar had taken the city. And some zealots had successfully assassinated him, and it created such panic that many of the people who were refugees in Jerusalem fled to Egypt because they felt that probably the Babylonian army would be back and there would be serious reprisals. So they continued a fast in the 7th month. So now the question about these 4 fasts each year, a fast in the 4th month, the 5th month, the 7th month, the 10th month, should they still be doing that? The temple is being built. Is it appropriate? Zechariah is going to respond through the word of the Lord, but his response is going to be somewhat enigmatic because he is not going to talk about their question, immediately at least, should they continue fasting, but rather he's going to talk about the nature of true fasting. Slide 81. The question that is raised then is, ask the people this question: when you fasted and mourned for these past 70 years, God says, is it really for me that you were fasting? Or are you just regretting what happened in the loss of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple? What is the nature of your fasting, in other words? Why are you actually fasting? Is this just some kind of a ritual of grief, or is there something more to that? Because the intent of true fasting is not simply to do without for yourself, but rather to also show mercy and compassion for the powerless and the disadvantaged. In fact, this is what the Lord had proclaimed in the earlier prophets when Jerusalem and its surrounding towns were at rest and prosperous, that they ought to be concerned about those who were disadvantaged, the powerless. You find many passages like this in the book of Amos and Hosea, back in the 8th century to the northern nation, and in Isaiah and Micah, also in the 8th century to the southern nation. This concept of social justice, that this was important and that fasting was not simply a matter of doing without, it was also a matter of concern for social justice. In fact, in Isaiah 58, there is a very similar passage to this passage in Zechariah 7, that fasting is not simply to do without, but it is to do without in order to supply the needs of others. By ignoring the preaching of the earlier prophets, the Israelites had incited God's anger against themselves, and this, of course, is why they were eventually exiled to Babylon. Even the Torah talks about concern for your neighbor. It talks about concern for the poor, concern for those who are aliens and those who are disadvantaged. And these kinds of elements in the Torah were flatly ignored by the people of Israel, and it eventually led to their exile. Now, actually, the question about whether they should continue the celebration of these 4 fast days is going to be answered later in chapter 8. But for the time being, what Zechariah says to the people as the word of the Lord is that this is what Yahweh Sabaoth says. If you want to fast truly, you need to administer true justice. Show mercy and compassion to one another. Be concerned about the widow. Be concerned about the orphan. Be concerned about the alien. Be concerned about the poor. And in your hearts, don't think ill of each other. Your fathers didn't listen to these kinds of words, and they didn't pay attention to that. And that, of course, resulted in the exile. And so when I called for them to think about these things, they wouldn't listen to me. And so when they called, I wouldn't listen to them. I scattered them with a whirlwind among the nations, and they've been exiled as strangers, and the land was desolate behind them. And this is how it happened. And this is why it happened. So, more than the technical question of should we observe certain fast days is the more important question. What is the nature of true fasting? From there, we go to the final oracle in the dated section of the book of Zechariah, and this is chapter 8, slide 82. This third oracle is composed of 10 promises that describe the blessedness of being restored by the Lord. Each of these 10 promises begins with the same formula. Thus says Yahweh Sabaoth. Now, in your Bible, depending on which translation you're reading, it may translate Yahweh Sabaoth as the Lord Almighty or something like that. But underlying this is the Hebrew name Yahweh Sabaoth. The 10 promises that are given here recall earlier themes in Zechariah's oracles, and some of them reaching all the way back to Haggai's oracles. But you need to remember, of course, that Haggai and Zechariah worked together. They were contemporaries of each other, and so it's not too surprising that some of Zechariah's oracles actually recall things that were said by Haggai, because they worked in tandem as the two prophets aiding Zerubbabel and Joshua in the rebuilding project. So we will look at these 10 promises briefly, each one at a time. In the first promise, which is the first 2 verses of chapter 8, the word of Yahweh Sabaoth says, this is what Yahweh Sabaoth says. I'm very jealous for Zion. I am burning with passion for her. This is what the Lord says. I will return to Zion and dwell in Jerusalem. And then Jerusalem will be called the city of truth, and the mountain of Yahweh Sabaoth will be called the holy mountain. Now, in this particular passage, you'll especially notice the key word jealous and jealousy. You'll remember that back in chapter 1 and verse 14 of Zechariah, this same idea is used, that God is very jealous for Jerusalem. And at that time, I explained to you that the word jealous does not mean envy so much as it means passionate. So in this passage, when God says, I'm very jealous for Zion, the nuance that you should read is, I am very passionate for Zion. I'm very passionate for Jerusalem. I intend for this city to be rebuilt and for this temple to be rebuilt. And this is part of my plan. I'm very passionate about it. And, of course, by implication, how could the people who were rebuilding be anything less than passionate about something that God was passionate? If God is passionate, then the least that they could do is be passionate themselves and to join wholeheartedly in the work. In the second promise, which is in verse 3, the city of truth and the holy mountain will be reclaimed from their former faithlessness and their former defilement. You find reference to that earlier in Zechariah. Back in chapter 1 and verse 17, the Lord said, my towns will again overflow with prosperity, and Yahweh will again comfort Zion and choose Jerusalem. And then in chapter 2 and verse 12, you have that same kind of idea. Yahweh will inherit Judah as his portion in the Holy Land and will again choose Jerusalem. So verse 3, in which God returns to Zion and dwells in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is called the city of truth and the holy mountain. These are reaffirmations of those earlier promises that were made in the earlier oracles of Zechariah. The third promise is verses 4 and 5. This is what Yahweh Sabaoth says. Once again, men and women of ripe old age will sit in the streets of Jerusalem, each with cane in hand because of his age, and the city streets will be filled with boys and girls playing there. What a wonderful vision of peace and tranquility, with the older people, no doubt grandparents, sitting and watching the children play in peace and safety. This future that is characterized by peacefulness is described earlier in somewhat different language, but still very much the same idea that we mentioned earlier in chapter 1 and verse 17, that the towns will overflow with prosperity and the Lord will comfort Zion and choose Jerusalem. Slide 83. The fourth promise is a question. Very similar to the question, will it seem impossible to me? It's very much like the question that was asked all the way back in the time of Abraham and Sarah when they were anticipating the birth of Isaac. And God appeared to Abraham and said, "Is anything too hard for me?" And the same question is asked in the confrontation between Gabriel and Mary just prior to the birth of Jesus. Is anything too hard for the Lord? So in verse 6, then, of Zechariah 8, it says, "This is what Yahweh Sabaoth says. It may seem marvelous to the remnant of this people at this time, but will it seem marvelous to me, declares Yahweh Sabaoth." Now, that may seem like an odd way of stating things, at least in our modern language, but the idea is that even if this is incredibly great in your vision, this is really almost matter of fact for God, because nothing is impossible with God. He doesn't see things as impossible. And so even though it may seem very hard to anyone else, it certainly would not be hard for the Lord. This, of course, goes back to something that was said in Haggai, chapter 2 and verse 3, in which they looked at what was happening there with the foundation of the temple and then the fact that no one was working on it. And Haggai asked the question, "Who of you is left who saw this house in its former glory? And how does it look to you now? Doesn't it seem like nothing?" And yet, what seemed like nothing to them, it would not be impossible for God to rectify that situation by his power and by his might. The fifth promise is in verses 7 and 8. This is what Yahweh Sabaoth says. "I'll save my people from the countries of the east and the west, and I will bring them back to live in Jerusalem, and they will be my people, and I will be faithful and righteous to them as their God." The regathering of God's remnant, God's elect, is directly linked to his living among them. And once again, this is linked back to Zechariah chapter 2, verses 10 and 11, which says, "I am coming, says the Lord, and I will live among you. I am coming, and I will live among you, and many nations will be joined to the Lord and will become my people, and I will live among you, and you will know that Yahweh Sabaoth has sent me to you." So, the future that is linked with this rebuilding of the temple includes the regathering of God's people. Promise number 6 is in verses 9 through 13. This is a little bit longer passage than the others. "This is what Yahweh Sabaoth says, you who now hear these words spoken by the prophets who were there when the foundation was laid for the house of Yahweh Sabaoth. Let your hands be strong so that the temple may be built. Before that time there were no wages for man or beast. No one could go about his business safely because of his enemy, for I had turned every man against his neighbor. But now I will not deal with the remnant of this people as I did in the past. The seed will grow well, and the vine will yield its fruit. The ground will produce its crops, and the heavens will drop their dew, and I will give all these things as an inheritance to the remnant of this people. You will be a blessing, so don't be afraid. Let your hands be strong." Now, this particular passage really goes back to Haggai chapter 2 and verse 13. You may remember that in Haggai there was this ongoing question about what was spreading among the people, whether it was a good attitude or a bad attitude. But now they were to give careful thought to this day, the 24th day of the 9th month of the 2nd year of Darius. Haggai chapter 2, verse 10, 24th day of the 9th month, and then notice verse 15, give careful thought to this day. After this day, things are going to be different. Things are going to be a matter of blessing, not a matter of deprivation. So when you get to the end of Haggai 2, verse 19, it says, "From this day on I will bless you." And so the sixth promise is that even though times had been difficult in the past, they had faced opposition, they had faced deprivation, all of these terrible circumstances are going to be reversed. They need to simply have boldness and courage to go forward in completing the work of the Lord. The seventh promise is verses 14 through 17. This is what Yahweh Sabaoth says. "Just as I had determined to bring disaster upon you, and showed no mercy or no pity when your fathers angered me, so now I've determined to do good to Jerusalem and Judah. Don't be afraid. These are the things you are to do. Speak the truth to each other. Give true and sound judgment in your courts. Don't plot evil against your neighbor. and don't swear falsely, because I hate all of these things. The judgment of exile is now to be reversed, but the remnant must remember that they are to live according to the covenant. And this particular promise, promise number 7, is linked back to the vision of the flying scroll, in which on one side there was a curse upon those who were breaking the commandment about theft, and on the other side there was a curse upon those who were breaking the commandment about swearing falsely. So this promise number 7 reaffirms the vision in the flying scroll, that the people must live according to God's covenant morality if they're going to succeed. Slide 84. The 8th promise finally answers the question about the ritual feasts. That question was asked all the way back at the beginning of chapter 7, and now in verses 18 and 19, the word of the Lord was this. This is what Yahweh Sabaoth says. The fasts of the 4th, 5th, 7th, and 10th months will become joyful and glad occasions and happy festivals for Judah. In other words, though these 4 festival days or fast days had been days of mourning and grief because of the loss of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, now they are going to become days of celebration. They become occasions not for mourning, but days of rejoicing, because now truth and peace are prevailing. The 9th promise is in verses 20 through 22. This is what Yahweh Sabaoth says. Many peoples and the inhabitants of many cities will come, and the inhabitants of one city will go to another and say, let us go at once to entreat Yahweh and seek Yahweh Sabaoth. I myself am going. And many peoples and powerful nations will come to Jerusalem to seek Yahweh Sabaoth and to entreat him. Now, this idea that the nations will come to this new temple that's being built goes back to something stated in Haggai chapter 2 and verse 7. In Haggai 2 and verse 7 it says, the desired of all nations will come, and I will fill this house with glory. And then earlier in Zechariah chapter 2 and verse 11, when the Lord will inherit Zion, once again he will choose Jerusalem, and it says that many nations will be joined with the Lord in those days and will become his people. Somehow the building of this second temple is linked to the idea of the promise to the nations, that all of the nations will worship the Lord. So they have a stake in this great future by building the temple. And then finally, the last of the 10 promises, which is in the last verse of chapter 8. This is what Yahweh Sabaoth says. In those days, 10 men from all languages and nations will take firm hold of one Jew by the edge of his robe and say, let's go with you because we've heard that God is with you. This idea of the nations clinging to the edge of the robe of a Jew in order to come to the Lord really goes all the way back to the promise originally given to Abraham, that in Abraham and his seed all the nations of the earth would be blessed. And so this promise is reaffirmed here, that in the rebuilding of the second temple, they have a stake in God's large, big picture. And that large, big picture is that not just simply the Jews, but the nations will be blessed through the seed of Abraham. This is now on the cusp of fulfillment with the building of the second temple. So these 10 promises point to this great redemptive work that God intended to do in the world. In rebuilding the temple, the remnant community had a crucial role to play in God's redemptive future. And in fact, as we read these passages today, there's no doubt in the minds of Christians through the centuries that we read these passages as highly messianic. They have this strong sense that what happened to the returnees from Babylon in the rebuilding of the second temple had a link to God's future. And as Haggai said, the glory of the second temple would be greater than the glory of the first one. And the implications stretch all the way to the Messianic age and the coming of Jesus Christ, the Messiah. This is the end of Lecture 9.